I don't personally know of anything that is more of a challenge than a propensity for depression. Depression, I'm told by knowledgeable sources, is the number one health issue in North America. I'm told that more medications are prescribed to treat depression, more hospital visits um, and physician visits are um, based on, or at least include as one of their elements, depression. And of course, depression is a continuum. Um, when I was in college, I took an abnormal psychology course from the only living man who had a building named after him. He was a retired dean and was teaching not because anybody was making him, but because he loved it. And he was considered one of the foremost clinical psychologists in the world. It was an honor to take a class from him, and there was so much that I learned in that class. But um, without going into all that, he a phrase that he repeated numerous times and which stuck with me. He said, "The mentally ill person is like us, only more so." And so, of course, so it is with depression. Almost everybody, unless you're a narcissist, unless you're a sociopath, almost everybody gets depressed. Um, there are feelings of sadness, which are perfectly normal every time there's loss. There's grief and there's sorrow, and the greater the loss, the greater the grief, the greater the sorrow. That's common to us as human beings. Um, and I think also common to, again, all of us, but the most narcissistic of us, uh, are those times when we feel down in the dumps, when we feel blue, when we feel discouraged. But clinical depression is extremely painful and, in my experience, impossible to get out of without help. Clinical depression can involve a number of symptoms. Um, it can, but doesn't always involve feelings of being really down and discouraged, or periods of breaking down, crying, sadness. We think of all those things as equated with depression. Some people are depressed and they don't feel those kinds of things, although many do, probably most do. But depression can also show up in things like insomnia. Um, there are people who um, try to feed the depression away by overeating. There are people who try to starve it away by not eating enough. Um, Depression can make it can be like a feeling of physical heaviness. It can literally physically hurt. Depression can make it hard, almost impossible, to get out of bed in the morning, to go on with life. When you're depressed, it feels like everything is hopeless and there's no solution. And the good news about depression is that it is highly treatable. That doesn't mean it's easy to treat. It requires two things, usually. It requires the right medication in the right dosage, and it requires some kind of talk therapy, normally kind of a cognitive behavioral style of therapy. The medication is not easy. And we're not talking about medication that perks you up. We're not talking about taking an amphetamine so that you feel high, which, by the way, one of the worst things that anyone can do when they're depressed is try to medicate it themselves with alcohol, which is a depressant, makes you more depressed after the initial high wears off, or with street drugs. That's a good way to kill yourself. Slowly, but effectively. Excuse me. But I'm talking about legitimate medication. There's some good ones out there. Generally speaking, family physicians are not overly familiar with them. It's better, I think, to when it comes to medication, to consult a skilled psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who can find the right medicine and then the right dosage to help you. And sometimes it's a temporary thing, and sometimes it's an ongoing thing. And some of those medications, depending on what it is, require regular blood tests to make sure the level is proper. For instance, with bipolar disorder, there's a medication which is commonly used, and the therapeutic level is very close to the toxic level. So the blood has to be checked on a regular basis to make sure it's right in that sweet spot. So medication, but medication by itself won't cure the depression. It's a mistake to take the medicine and say, well, that's all I need to do. Psychotherapy is also needed. And again, that can be a challenge because finding the right therapist can take some time. You do the research and you check into things and you check with your insurance, and of course insurance can be a hassle because so many insurance policies don't cover mental health care in this country. But anyway, so then you go to a therapist and you work with them, and it just isn't the right fit, and then you have to start over with somebody else, and so it goes. But when you find that right therapist and you have that right level of the correct medicine, the two things working together are almost certain to cure the depression. And that's a good thing because depression it hurts. And of course, many times depression leads to suicide. And as we often have said, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Almost without exception, people who attempt suicide and then do not succeed and physically recover from their attempt, almost without exception, they look back on that and say, oh, I'm so glad that didn't work. I'm so glad, they found me. I'm so glad they stopped me. I'm so glad they, administered the proper treatment, got me to the hospital, whatever. Suicide solves nothing except making life horrible for those that you leave behind. And it can even, if you're a parent, give permission to your children to try to solve life's problems that way. It devastates families. I know my son committed suicide. My mother's father committed suicide. And I've been at times to the place where I was um, seriously thinking about suicide. In my case, what stopped me was knowing what devastation was caused in my own family and not wanting to do that to um, my wife, my children, and others that I care about. So depression is a widespread problem, um, and I have battled with it um, off and on my entire life. Um, and I think it probably has a genetic connection. I'm sure it has a family connection. Both of my parents struggled with depression. As I mentioned, my maternal uh, grandfather died from suicide. Um, there's been a lot of depression in the system. And then in my case, when my son committed suicide, it plunged me into despair. And it brought me to the place where everything I believed and my whole religio-philosophical belief system was challenged to the core. But all I'd like to communicate is that if you're depressed, if you struggle with depression, you're not doing anything wrong spiritually. It's not just an attack from Satan. It's not that you're failing to stand on the promises of God. It's not that anything's wrong with you. What you're experiencing is the common experience that many of us go through. That's number one. Number two, there is help. Find a good psychiatrist, have a consultation. It probably only take one time. And if the psychiatrist prescribes some medicine, take it as prescribed. And secondly, find a good psychotherapist. Ask some friends. Try out some different people. Check with maybe your pastor or someone else that you look up to. And don't be discouraged if the medication doesn't work magic. Don't be discouraged if it has to be changed or adjusted in dosage. Don't be discouraged if the first therapist that you meet with isn't the perfect fit or can only take you thus far and then someone else is going to have to take you on the next leg of things. But get the help that you need. For the sake of your loved ones, for the sake of your friends, for the sake of yourself, because you were created in the image of God, and therefore you're worth it.